Okay. Well, I guess I can kick us off then. So maybe we'll start with a round of introductions from our side here at the IEA. I'll start. My name is James Bragg. I'm an energy investment analyst within the energy investment unit here at the IEA. And our team does a lot of work looking at the business and financing models for the power system. And indeed, we've done a lot of work recently focusing on grids and financing for grids over the past few months. And yeah, we're really happy today to lead the session focusing on grids financing and kind of painting a broad landscape of the grids investment, grids financing, business models, etc. And so I'm joined today with my colleague Lorenzo and Natalie. Maybe you can do a quick introduction.
Thank you, James. Nice to meet you all. I'm Lorenzo Albertini, and as James was mentioning, I'm working in the investment unit, especially focusing on Africa-related topic. And one of the main work we are doing is how we can attract investment in the different sectors to tackle energy access.
Maybe over to you, Natalie.
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm Natalie St. Clair. I work in the Energy Supply Unit in the International Energy Agency, primarily on policy and regulatory analysis. And I've also been supporting Lorenzo and some of the investment unit with work on grids financing in Africa.
Great. So I can kick us off then. I'll start with just a brief agenda of what we'll try to cover in this presentation today. I think the title was on regional case studies and alternative financing models for grids. And that will be covered in today's session, but we wanted to do a lot more than that. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we've laid out some key questions that we're hoping to touch upon during this presentation within the first 60 minutes, and then hopefully leave 20 to 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A. But first, we wanted to take a look at the investment landscape into grids in emerging market and developing economies. So we thought it would be a good place to start to look at how much is being invested in grids today and how much is going to be needed in these countries looking forward to the next 10 years. I'll then spend some time talking about some of the typical business and financing models that we see for transmission and distribution in emerging market and developing economies today, and also looking at exactly how these projects are typically being financed. And I think this sort of leads into a nice discussion and allows us to more accurately identify what some of the key challenges are to meeting investment needs in E&D in the future. And for that, we're going to be focusing on a lot of the findings that are coming out of some reports that we're working on right now. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the key solutions and priorities that we've identified in our work. And Natalie and Lorenzo are going to walk us through some case studies and some alternative financing models from Latin America and Africa that we thought were quite interesting. So before I jump into some of the investment results, I just wanted to bring a couple of reports to everyone's attention. So the first two are recently published reports. Just a few months ago, we released our report on financing electricity access in Africa. So this is a really good overview of the finance landscape for electricity access in the region. And it also lays out a very nice pathway in terms of what is needed to finance universal access. Earlier this year, it's less to do with the topic of financing, but I think it's still really relevant for any topics related to grids. We released this report called Building the Future Transmission Grid, which focuses more so on the supply chains. And in particular, it zooms in on some of the market tightness and some of the supply chain constraints that we're seeing around the world today. And so this is a theme that keeps coming back into our analyses. But the presentation today is going to draw extensively from some reports that will be published over the coming months. So myself, I've been working on a report which is focused on the ASEAN region and how to finance cross-border interconnectors in the region. And then Lorenzo and the Africa team have been working a lot on two separate reports. The first is financing transmission in Africa, so very similar report, it's going to be looking at the business and financing models and outlining some useful case studies for mobilizing investment. And then there was this Uganda-specific roadmap about building an investment plan for the national grid in Uganda. So please do keep an eye out for these reports when they're published. They will go into a lot more detail than what we have time for today. But just starting out looking at the investment landscape. So over the past 10 years in emerging market and developing economies, we have seen really solid progress in terms of an acceleration of investment into electricity generation. In particular, we've seen a pickup post-COVID, and around 2022 is when things really started to accelerate. And so in 2024, emerging market and developing economies were investing double the levels that they saw just 10 years ago. However, when we build into the picture the story of grids, we see something completely different. It's not only the case that grids investment has not been keeping up with investment into electricity generation. We see that today, or at least in 2024, investment into grids in EMDE is actually 13% lower than it was 10 years ago. And so for us here at the IEA, this is a major concern, and maybe the audience has heard about all the problems associated with underinvestment in grids around the world, including new bottlenecks for renewables deployment, but it also has potentially some energy security and system efficiency implications because the grid cannot function properly and efficiently and reliably if we're not investing in grids while we're building out lots of renewables. So how do different regions fare in terms of historical investment into transmission and distribution? What you're looking at here on this slide is the average annual investment into grids over the 2015 to 2019 period. And if we contrast that with the previous 5 years, we see a pretty ubiquitous trend across the developing world, which is that grid investment has been falling in most regions. And India really stands out as being an area or a location where grid investment has fallen off. Southeast Asia as well as Middle East and North Africa, whereas at least in absolute terms, Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, the decrease is less pronounced. But it's actually a lot better when we're looking at these historical investment figures to tie it to electricity generation investment. Typically, what we would expect to see is that investments in grids and electricity generation, they don't necessarily need to move in lockstep, but the two should be related to each other. And so what this chart is doing is it's expressing investment into electricity grids as a percentage of investment going into new generation capacity. So for instance, over the 2015 to 2019 period in India, for every $1 that was spent on electricity generation, about 80 cents was invested in grids. And so when you tie grids investment to generation investment, I think you start to see a much more clearer picture in terms of where needs are and where they're not being met. In India, again, we're really seeing a disconnect emerge. Also, this is very pronounced in Southeast Asia, but in Sub-Saharan Africa as well too. Whereas the Middle East, North Africa, and Latin America, it is beginning to see a bit of a disconnect, but not as pronounced as what we see in other regions. Okay, so looking towards the future, I just wanted to outline some of the key drivers of investment needs in the future. Of course, most intuitively, rising electricity demand is going to be the key driver for infrastructure needs. The more electricity that is being consumed, the more we need transmission and distribution to be built. And in this figure, we have emerging market and developing economies, excluding China in blue. And we can see that in absolute terms, this is where electricity demand is going to grow the fastest. And indeed, by 2050, we're expecting them to take a much higher share of global electricity consumption. But another key driver of the increased need in grid investment has to do with the type of technologies that we're adding to the grid. Historically, many power systems were built up of sort of larger scale dispatchable assets where the location of that asset could be more optimally placed. If we look towards the future where solar and wind make up an increasing share of new capacity additions, we are more likely to see cases or additional spending on transmission just because these resources are much more distributed spatially. Oftentimes, solar and wind need to be placed at locations where their utilization rate is high. And so we might see a lot more long distance transmission, for instance, connecting to offshore wind farms than what we would have otherwise seen if we just had a grid composed of hydro or dispatchable fossil generators. And then finally, an important trend which is not talked about a whole lot is actually the change in terms of the technologies of the transmission lines. So this figure is just showing the growth in high voltage direct current lines. Simply put, this technology is much more optimal for transporting electricity longer distances and through subsea segments because it minimizes transmission losses. And so this leads to a much more efficient system, but it comes at the expense of actually being a lot more capital intensive because these HVDC lines require much more expensive converter stations to be built. And if we look towards the future, which has a lot more interconnectors between systems, a lot more connections to offshore wind farms, this is another key driver. So the change in technology, more renewables and higher electricity demand are pointing towards an acceleration in investment. So how much is annual investment in grids going to change? On the left-hand side of the slide, we have total investment across all emerging market and developing economies except China. And you can see that in 2024, annual spending was about $80 billion across transmission and distribution. And by 2035, we're expecting that to about double, up to $160 billion per year. There is some regional variation, of course, due to country-specific factors, but also due to differences in how fast electricity demand is growing or how quickly renewables are penetrating. So, for instance, India is really charted to see the fastest growth in investment needs, followed by Latin America, but also Southeast Asia and Middle East and Africa. Really, the most developing regions are set to see very large increase in investment needs compared to current levels. So a key question moving forward then is, are the business models and the financing models that we see across these regions today, do they help facilitate capital coming into the sector, or is there potentially some bottlenecks in these business and financing models that need to be addressed? And so that's what we'll talk about for the rest of this presentation. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now just talking about some of the typical archetypes in terms of business and financing models that we see in E&D. These are not meant to be exhaustive, and oftentimes power market structures are very idiosyncratic. And so maybe a country doesn't nicely fit into any one of these archetypes. It's a combination of multiple, but I still think it's helpful for sort of laying out the foundations for the discussion. So the first archetype that we see is this bundled SOE approach. Okay, and maybe an example of this would be in Indonesia, but in essence, this is a case where the state-owned enterprise is involved in electricity generation, and it also has essentially a monopoly license for transmission and distribution. So although there is some commercial financing, maybe from local lenders or development finance banks, or development finance banks involved, the public sector here, it really is paramount. And so under this model, all transmission and distribution investments are typically financed on the balance sheet of the SOE. And, taking consideration the massive increase in investment needs over the next 10 years, as well as the financial health of some of these SOEs, that's sort of a key concern to us. And then another potential issue with this model has to do with the revenue model and how costs are recovered. Costs are recovered at the corporate level under this bundled SOE approach, and they're recovered through sort of retail tariffs, which reflect the cost of not just transmission or distribution, but generation as well too. So it's very difficult to understand, if under this particular model, different types of investors were to come in, there isn't an established framework for recovering costs for transmission as its own distinct service. Another model that we often see in emerging market and developing economies is a slight variant called unbundled SOE. It's quite similar, but the difference here is that you do have distinct legal entities for transmission and distribution companies. They can still be state-owned enterprises. The financing structure is very similar. It's done on balance sheet as well too. But the key advantage to this is that there's already an existing transmission tariff. It doesn't necessarily need to be cost reflective. The methodology for determining that tariff might vary a lot between countries, but we do have some starting point in terms of a revenue model established for transmission as a service. And so that's a helpful stepping stone if other parties are going to come into the sector. In EMDs, we also see cases of this dedicated power evacuation line. So this is kind of a special case, but oftentimes an independent power producer will build and finance a generation source as well as a transmission line to evacuate the power. And so typically, this takes the form of being a joint venture between public or private actors, or a consortium of private developers and an SPV. So it's off-balance sheet financing. And the costs of the project, including the generation source as well as the transmission line, are sort of bundled together, and they're recovered through a power purchasing agreement. Okay, so there's no sort of like separate cost recovery for the transmission line on its own. The service here is not transmission, it's really just the generation. And the SOE still ultimately controls really how much electricity is used, and they act as the main off-taker for these dedicated power evacuation lines. But these ones have been quite successful in countries like Laos PDR in terms of attracting private sector capital, just because the revenue source is a little bit more clear. And now moving on to some more niche cases where there is increasing private sector involvement. This first one is called an operating lease. A good example of it would be NCGP in the Philippines. But basically, in this model, a government entity is granting a private corporation the right to sort of build out and finance and operate the transmission network. And so technically, the government might still be the owner of the transmission network, but in terms of who operates it, it is entirely this concessionaire. And so this involves a lot more private financing than the unbundled SOE model, but the structure is very much the same in terms of cost recovery and in terms of the capital structure. So the fifth model, and this one is one that we really want to highlight, and we'll come back to towards the end of this presentation, is the independent transmission project model. So we think this has been a really good case study where in countries like Brazil and for some auctions in India, this model has successfully brought in international and private sources of capital into the T&D sector. But how it works is usually a government entity or the system operator, they auction out individual lots or transmission lines to the private sector. And they set some sort of maximum price ceiling on the price they're willing to pay for that transmission project. And these private developers, or not necessarily private developers, but the developers can compete against each other by bidding. And so why this model we think is quite interesting is that from an SOE financing perspective, of course, it's not on their balance sheet, so it might circumvent some of the cash flow constraints that we might see in the coming decades. But it's also quite a good example of a very solid and predictable revenue framework. where the people who are developing the project, they know that if they meet minimum performance criteria, if they make sure that the line is available, they will get their payment. And then finally,
no, you can finish. Just to let you know, they have a couple of questions in the chat once you finish.
okay, sure. I'm happy to pause here and take some questions if that's helpful. But maybe just quickly on the mini grids, this is something that we'll talk about more towards the end of the presentation when we highlight some of these case studies. But of course, we're talking about small scale grid networks, mostly in rural settings, but I'll leave that to Lorenzo to talk about. I can't see the questions. Do you want to read them out, Tawana?
Yes, of course. So the first one is from Laurent. So his first thank you for the presentation, and he's asking, would the quality of supply, SAFI and SAIDI, and for instance, a poor quality not also be also a key driver? So I don't know if you want to compliment, Laurent. If you want to just open your mic, also feel free.
A key driver. Yeah, maybe Laurent, would you want to ask the question again? Sorry, I'm not sure.
Yep, yeah, no, it's thank you, James, again. It's just that when you presented the key drivers that support investments in T&D, from experience, poor quality of supply, and namely intermittent supply with lot of interruption is a key driver. And ironically, it doesn't really show in the amount of electricity you supply. However, it could kill any business because if you have constant interruption, it doesn't work on. Just to reflect on the mission that we did together with Frankfurt School in Zambia, it was very much the case. The quality of supply was so poor that in fact people couldn't even safely use electricity, in particular SMEs. It's much more obviously for industrial purposes.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And in our apologies for not mentioning that, but grid reinforcements, grid modernization, that is also a key driver of our underlying investment model. And these numbers do take that into consideration, but indeed, I didn't put that here. So thank you for the intervention. Was there another question, Tawana, or?
Yes, I can read it, or otherwise, Osama, also feel free to jump in. So his question is on the ITP model. Under IFRS rules, does the lease over the lease period appear as a liability in the balance sheet of the SOE?
So this is a very technical question. I can't claim to know off by heart IFRS rules. My understanding, though, is that of course, it depends. But for the ITP model in Brazil, Natalie will walk through some of the details later on. But it's my understanding that some financing was provided by BNDES, but the rest is financed from the private sector. So it's not just that it's not on the SOE balance sheet. It's just that to a large extent, the traditional historical investors in the grid network are not providing financing to these projects, but instead development banks and are providing finance. So I believe that they are off balance sheet structures, usually SPVs, but maybe that might not always be the case.
Perfect, thanks.
Thank you. And if I may, Tawana, this is Osama.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understood the difference between the operating lease and the ITP. So if you can go back to the operating lease, when you say the SOE leases the T&D assets to the concessionaire, I'm sorry. Who is the concessionaire and how this model works?
Yeah, sorry about that. I can clarify this a little bit. So in the Philippines, I guess like the big difference between this like long-term operating lease is that it's like a whole of the grid network lease or a whole of the transmission network lease, right? So NCGP is entitled to operate and develop and is responsible for the entirety the Philippines national grid, or its core grid network anyways, right? In the ITP model, this is a sort of a competitive auctioning process for individual transmission line lots. Okay, so auctions are held, every year for individual segments of the lines, right? And so in terms of the ownership and the financing, you have many different parties providing financing to individual lots of the transmission network rather than having one private company be responsible for the entirety of the transmission network. And that's really the key difference.
So in the operating lease, you have an SOE that is public, that owns the assets, and you have on top of that an operating transmission operator that doesn't own the assets but only operates the grid. No,
we're talking about the operating lease.
Yes.
Yeah. So essentially, this is a bit nuanced, the whole ownership and operations things. De facto, the concessionaire in the Philippines, I'm not sure exactly how the legal arrangements work in practice, but this is not on the balance sheet of any government entity, right? So technically, I think the transmission network is still owned by the state, but for all intents and purposes, the day-to-day operations and all the decision making is sort of established by NGCP of the Philippines. Of course, they're a highly regulated entity, so they interact with many government stakeholders. But yeah.
Okay. All right, it's clear. Thank you very much.
I can send you some further information on these different models offline as well too, if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, what time is it? 1:30. Great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the sources of finance and indeed who is making investments and where is financing coming from towards transmission and distribution in emerging markets and developing economies today. And so indeed, I think at least on the left-hand side of this chart, of the slide, you can see that in recent years, historically, most of the time it is this SOE-led model that is sort of the predominant model across the emerging markets and developing economies. Most investments are guided by SOEs. However, there is a lot of heterogeneity across different countries. It's not always the case. And oftentimes we see a lot more private sector involvement in the distribution sector. But still, this sort of bundled or unbundled SOE approach is quite commonplace. And so what we're trying to do on this slide is, say if these financing business models were kept in place, what would that imply in terms of investments and sources of finance from different sources and instruments? And I think, at least from the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that, if the SOE-led model is maintained, this does have some big implications in terms of how much additional financing on balance sheet is going to be needed in a lot of these countries. And sort of this helps kind of frame some discussions later on about potential challenges that this might create. In terms of the ultimate sources of finance, so first, development finance institutions are active already in this area, primarily in Africa, but also to some extent in other regions historically as well. But a lot of finance is still coming from commercial lenders, and of course, there's a big role of the public sector through their equity stakes in these SOEs, as well as direct subsidies to these projects. And then in terms of the leverage ratio, we've seen historically about a 50-50 split between debt and equity going towards these T&D projects. But there is a lot of variation across the different regions. So I think Africa, we definitely do see this SOE model being quite predominant. And this is the region where we're seeing a lot more finance coming from development finance institutions and a lot higher needs for concessional financing in the future. But that's juxtaposed with a region like Latin America, where actually there's been a lot more privatization or private sector involvement in the T&D sector. And so SOEs still play a role in the future, but a lot of investment is going to come from the private sector. We're projecting that a lot more commercial finance is going to be needed in Latin America. Whereas in Southeast Asia, this is quite, we're dealing with a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the market structures. You know, as I mentioned, there's countries such as the Philippines or Singapore where you see highly liberalized markets with more private sector participation. But you also have countries like Vietnam and Indonesia where this SOE-led model is still in place. So here you see a bit of a balance in terms of investment coming from SOEs and the private sector under current business models. A mix of commercial finance and public finance is certainly needed, and we anticipate DFIs also to be important in the region. We're thinking about all these new initiatives for the APG from the World Bank and ADB that are trying to promote domestic grid strengthening and regional interconnectivity moving forward. So at this point, having explored the investment needs, the different business and financing models, I thought at this point we would provide a bit of a high-level overview of what we see in terms of the reports that we've been writing are some of the major challenges to financing grids in emerging market and developing economies. So I've addressed this, structured this in terms of different themes. So the first theme really is this capacity and access to financing. I won't go into a whole lot of detail here, but it's often the case that many countries view T&D as being sort of a strategically important sector, and oftentimes the regulatory and legal frameworks are such that it's difficult for other sources of capital to get involved in the sector, be they private or from international sources. But as I mentioned before too, just given the massive increase in investment needs that are needed and the business models that we see today, and on top of that, the financial health of some of the SOEs in certain countries, a big worry for us is just the balance sheet constraints and whether realistically a lot of these countries can and would be willing to scale investment within the timelines needed to deploy the amount of renewable energy that is needed. Of course, there's many other constraints having to do with domestic capital markets. In this project we're writing on ASEAN, we've seen countries commercial banks in Indonesia and Vietnam start to breach their single borrow limits just because these SOEs are so massive. They're involved in many different activities. We see a bit of a maturity mismatch between the deposit base of local banks and the very long lifetime of these large-scale infrastructure assets. And of course, a lot of the time, there is no sort of secondary market for any exit out of these large-scale infrastructure projects. And then another thing that we've identified is that potentially sometimes the requirements needed to be eligible for green financing, they're very challenging to meet within a developing economy context. And so perhaps this makes it a little bit more challenging to have access to funds or providers that have an explicit climate focus. Another big challenge that we've identified, though, is just on the business model. It's very challenging to attract other sources of capital or to justify an investment when a lot of times the revenue source and the cost recovery structure is just not very clearly laid out. There's a lack of transparency. Sometimes revenue streams are unpredictable. And indeed, in many countries, of course, due to affordability, subsidies are really often used. But this creates a bit of a problem in terms of the financial health of the SOE as well too. So it's quite a difficult challenge. Of course, these transmission and distribution assets come with quite elevated risk profiles just due to the characteristics of these projects, big ticket items, very long lifetimes. They interact with many different government stakeholders and state-owned enterprises, so off-taker risks come in as well. The macro financial conditions, of course, are also absolutely key. To what extent there is stability in FX is a big determinant of whether these projects are bankable. And of course, that type of stability is not seen all over the world. And then finally, we have this less sort of financially relevant, but still, we think, relevant set of problems having to do with supply chains, and as well as for projects involving the connection between multiple systems. Sometimes misalignment in terms of grid codes or other standards and procedures can make those interconnections quite challenging to implement in practice. So I thought I would just highlight a few case studies from our upcoming report on financing ASEAN interconnectors to sort of bring this to life a little bit. So first on balance sheet financing, and what you're looking at here is what our estimated balance sheet financing needs are for interconnectors in ASEAN over the next 15 years by the different SOEs operating in the region. And when we looked at the financial health of some of these companies, it was quite concerning for us that there is a very big investment need to build out the APG, but there's potentially limited access or limited ability to finance some of these projects in the region. And at the same time, many of these countries are also trying to balance domestic priorities, domestic grid strengthening, with the need for more regional initiatives. And so we are quite concerned that potentially these interconnector projects might get kicked down the ladder a little bit. But another deep dive that we thought is quite relevant for much of the developing world was, we did an analysis of sort of like the green thresholds for the ASEAN sustainable finance taxonomy. And the top chart shows the grams or the average emissions intensity of the different countries in the region compared to the threshold needed to be eligible for green. And even in Laos, where there's an abundance of hydropower, it does not meet that threshold. And on the bottom, we have another criteria, which is about renewable capacity additions. And there it looks a little bit more promising, but still many countries are not yet at the point where they're deploying renewables fast enough. We're at the point where the emissions intensity is low enough to meet these thresholds for green finance. In this ASEAN Interconnectors project too, we also tried to do some sensitivity analysis in terms of what are some of the things, if you wanted to get different investor types interested in transmission projects, what are some of the factors that drive project IRR over equity IRR? And what we found is quite interesting. We found that in terms of the operational factors like transmission and distribution losses or operations and maintenance costs, that these really didn't move the needle too much in terms of equity IRR. What is really important is the variables that have to do with the business model. So what tariff is ultimately set at, the interest rate of the debt, and the gearing ratio are absolutely key. But also really interesting is what we found is that, in terms of the payment structure, if this large-scale asset were to be underutilized, it would seriously diminish the returns to investors if they do not have some sort of predictable revenue stream for their project. And I think that we'll come back to this when we talk about Brazil's ITP system and how the payment structure there works. But what we also
James, do you mind if I stopped you there and ask 2 questions?
Yeah.
From the audience, of course. It's from Laurent. So he's asking, would the monopolistic nature of the T&D not also be a barrier? And he has a second one asking, also, should we add the social dimension, so-called commercial losses, and cross-subsidize to the most deprived, which corrupts the revenue stream, at least for the distribution? I don't know
Yeah,
if it was clear enough, and Laurent, again, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah. No. I could clarify. My point being, James, when you listed all the buyer, my impression is that the monopolistic status of the lines, because unlike power plants, you see, you can't double the poles and have two competing networks. Which means that de facto you must have a certain kind of requirements, even if private sector get involved in terms of return, because population will never accept high return on monopolistic infrastructure. On my second question is that unlike generation, which revenue stream is relatively transparent because you have a meter, in distribution comes the question of so-called theft or commercial losses that nobody want to admit. And usually the burden is borne by the distribution company. Hence, again, some kind of reluctance from investors to take a distribution risk.
Yeah, really good points. So I agree with you in terms of given the monopolistic nature, and this is really an essential good. I hope I'm not giving the impression that the transmission and distribution network needs to turn into something that is giving out excessive returns to investors at the expense of ratepayers. Indeed, I think that actually, and we'll come to this when Natalie presents her case study, we have still seen models where, although yes, like in Brazil, there's sort of your monopolistic transmission operator, but by having competition come in and competing for these individual lots, they've been able to deliver the service at a much lower cost than what they were initially asking for as well too. So it's not always the case that bringing in private investors necessarily leads to an outcome where you're paying a higher cost for the service. But I do take your point. And yeah, really interesting case study on the risks. We found that in ASEAN, this wasn't something that was too relevant for that region. But I think it's still a really good point and sort of points towards having an appropriate strategy for the allocation of risks, depending on what type of business model you want to implement and who you're trying to bring to the table. Potentially for investors, as you said, or certain types of investors, this is too great of a risk for them to come to the table. So, really good points. I hope that answered your question, Laurent.
Yep, thank you, James.
Was there another question, Tawana, or?
No, you can continue. Thanks.
Thank you for your engagement, Laurent. I'm just checking the time because I want to, I'm going to fly through this really quickly. So if it's of interest to the audience, please do read this Financing ASEAN Interconnectors report, where we do some stylized financial analysis. And I think we sort of really try to underscore those parameters that are driving the bankability of large-scale transmission network, transmission assets. I'm sorry, but I don't think I'll have time to go through the supply chain constraints, unfortunately. So let me just skip over to the key priorities and solutions. So we, in our reports that we're writing, we sort of identified various priorities. Some of them are very relevant for the development finance community, but of course, scaling investment into transmission distribution is going to require efforts and actions among government, state-owned utilities, the private sector, and so on. And so we're going to focus on some case studies on alternative financial models in just a second. But I do want to say that strong national leadership is absolutely essential. Bankability has to really be contingent on transparent and sort of predictable cost recovery in a lot of cases. To Laurent's point earlier, there is a lot of risk associated with transmission projects in particular, and especially for these large-scale interconnector projects, which are receiving a lot of attention. And so building up a strategy and a very sort of streamlined approach to risk management is very important. But DFIs can really help to bridge financing gaps in the near term, and act as the anchor investor where commercial investors cannot. And in particular, we think that they can help to enable the creation of secondary markets. One thing that we talk about in our reports too is also something that we don't often see people talking about, or at least in some of the reports that we read, is just on capital recycling and exit. And we think it's important for the design of these projects to consider how to recycle capital and to build refinancing into agreements into day one, and consider building regional platforms which make the creation of these secondary markets easier. And then finally, touching upon this supply chain issue, which I skipped over, I think it's really important that in terms of power system planning, that the government is really making clear their procurement schedule, the technical specifications of these projects, and trying to really plan this out ahead of time, because we are seeing in some cases that many projects are being delayed, or the configurations and specifications have to change because they realize that they would have to wait much too long to get their hands on the equipment that they need for the project. So we've seen this as an increasing problem in parts of the world. But with that being said, we're going to focus on the third priority and solution that we have identified in these projects, alternative financial models. And so I'll hand over to Natalie to talk a bit about the Brazilian ITP model.
Thanks, James. And, I think you gave a really good overview of this model at the start, but we have a few examples here that will hopefully bring this to life and maybe clarify some of the questions that have already come up. So one of the most successful examples that we have of a country transitioning to allow private participation in their transmission grid is Brazil. For most of the 20th century, Brazil's power sector looked a lot like that of other emerging and developing economies that James was mentioning earlier. It was state-dominated, vertically integrated, with no competition or private sector participation. And transmission was lagging behind load growth due to underinvestment, bureaucracy, long project timelines. In the 90s, this fiscal situation reached a crisis point, and Brazil began a broader electricity sector reform to clear the way for private entry. And these reforms included the creation of the National Electric Energy Agency, ANEEL, by law in 1995. And by 1999, ANEEL had begun auctioning new transmission facilities through competitive bidding processes. In 2004, the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética was formed, the EPE, as a central strategic body that both directs long-term planning for the sector through 10-year expansion plans, and it also provides technical and economic studies to package bid-ready transmission projects. And these projects are granted as concessions through auctions that are regulated by ANEEL under the principle of livre acesso, meaning any qualified participant can submit a proposal. James, you can click ahead a couple just to fill in. Yeah. So then in terms of project financing, the main sources of finance have been private investors and institutional lenders, notably development banks. And I'll pause here for a moment on the role that these institutions have played, since it's of particular relevance to this group. So James talked about some of the specificities of these projects that creates challenges to finance. And the concessions under the ITP model typically rely on long tenor fixed debt, which commercial banks may not be able to provide at scale, which is where development banks can come in and supply senior debt at competitive rates, along with longer maturities that are aligned with concession revenue, and flexible repayment schedules, for instance, offering grace periods during the construction phase. So all of these measures effectively bring down the weighted cost of capital, which allows the winning bidders in the auction to offer lower tariffs. And it also creates a catalyzing effect for private capital. So the development bank serves as a structural lender, signaling that the project is bankable. And this attracts investors like commercial banks, infrastructure funds, and pension funds to enter with confidence and create blended finance arrangements. And to give a concrete example of this in Brazil, in 2017, the Brazilian National Development Bank announced an agreement with the main public and private banks in the country for sharing of guarantees and collateral in the financing of infrastructure projects. So any bank or union of banks that offers guarantees for these projects equivalent to at least 40% of the total financing would be entitled to share the guarantees and collateral with the Brazilian National Development Bank. Being a structural lender is probably the most prominent role that development banks can take in the system, but it's not the only one. In addition to providing this financial anchor, the Brazilian National Development Bank also takes an active role in structuring projects, conducting due diligence, and creating standard contract templates, which all ultimately increase the bankability of these projects. And under this auction model, bidders, so project developers, will compete on the lowest annual permitted revenue, which is also known as the RAP. So the bid RAP becomes the concessionaire's guaranteed annual payment, which solves for uncertainty in project returns. And the annual fixed payments are subject to the availability of the asset rather than actual utilization. So this solves for merchant risk. And the payments are also adjusted for inflation and foreign currency mechanisms. The concessions are typically awarded under long-term, so 25 to 30-year build, own, operate, transfer models. So linking this back to the challenges that James outlined earlier, we see that the ITP model in Brazil has effectively mitigated several risks. It addresses capacity issues and budget constraints by bringing in private players and taking financing off of the state balance sheet. The Central Planning Authority provides transparency in the project pipeline through long-term planning documents that are publicly available. The National Development Bank comes in and assumes risk as a structural lender and catalyzes a crowding-in effect. And then the business model of availability-based payments based on the bidded RAPs solves for uncertainty and market risk, along with mechanisms that address the macroeconomic risks to protect international investors. So all of these things and the predictability of the regulatory framework that underpins the system brings a lot of confidence to the market and is a key reason why Brazil has been able to scale transmission so quickly. If we go to the next slide, James referenced this earlier. Yeah, here we go. So you can see that the competitiveness of the system is evident based on the successful negotiations of all of the lots that were auctioned after 2017. Over the past 2 decades, the sector has witnessed participation of 250 different companies, resulting in 350 successful ITPs. And the discount rate, which is the discount from the initial revenue offer or cap that's set by ANIL, is now around 40%, which shows the success of the system in allocating the most cost-effective option. And just for maybe some additional background, ANIL calculates that revenue cap by factoring in operational and maintenance regulatory expenses, gross investment remuneration, and this is all derived from ANIL's own estimates of a weighted average cost of capital. And this weighted average cost of capital determines the rate of investment return. So it's the key parameter for companies to determine how worthy the project is regarding their own internal cost of capital. If we can move to the next slide. So if Brazil offers an example of a mature and scaled up system, then we can see in South Africa a good example of a country that has made very rapid recent progress in building an enabling regulatory environment for ITPs over the past few years. And actually, South Africa has been engaging in peer-to-peer exchanges with Brazil to learn from Brazil's process in sequencing long-term grid planning, packaging projects, and running competitive auctions and allocating risk. So we've identified some key milestones from their process here. 2 years ago, the cabinet endorsed the Independent Transmission Program, which provides the basis to allow private sector participation in development, financing, construction, and operation of transmission projects. And the 2024 Transmission Development Plan called for 14,500 kilometers of new transmission lines and 210 transformers to meet the new generation capacity that's needed from now until 2034. That number represents a 5-fold increase in delivery over the next 10 years compared with what was happening in South Africa over the previous decade. So clearly, significant strides need to be made to overcome the bottlenecks that have been holding back around 20 gigawatts of renewable energy from the solar arrays in the northern Cape of the country and wind farms in the western and eastern Capes to connect to the national electricity network. This year, the government completed a global market sounding exercise to solicit feedback and gauge market appetite from developers, financiers, operators, and OEMs. And they subsequently issued 2 important pieces of regulation. The ministerial determination in March of 2025 clearly designated the roles of different entities in transmission service agreements. So the Department of Electricity and Energy is the procurer, and the National Transmission Company is the single buyer under all TSAs. In April, they released the draft electricity transmission regulations for public comment, and these outline transparent cost recovery mechanisms, risk allocation, and enforceable project implementation frameworks. Around the same time, they launched the first phase of ITP procurement. In this first phase, there's a set of 7 pre-packaged projects of high-impact lines that were derived from the transmission master plan, totaling over 1,000 kilometers. And this will be a late-stage tender, which means that the regulatory framework, the environmental approvals and permits, the right-of-ways, and the licensing should all be in place by the time that the tender is released to market. This is a design that borrows from the lessons learned under South Africa's successful renewable energy investment PPP framework to create bid-ready projects. So from July until now, the IPP office has conducted a pre-qualification tender to come up with a short list of pre-qualified bidders for these 7 projects. And in parallel with these regulatory efforts and procurement efforts, the National Treasury is collaborating with the World Bank to develop an independent credit guarantee vehicle with the objective of mobilizing and leveraging private capital for these projects. The credit guarantee vehicle would target $500 million in initial capital, backed by blended finance from global DFIs, and the National Treasury has confirmed that it would inject 20% of this initial fund. We don't have all of the details about the credit vehicle yet, but the Treasury has indicated that it would extend a combination of payment and termination guarantees to the ITP special purpose vehicles, which would pay premiums to the vehicle that would then be recoverable through the electricity tariff. And it would operate as a standalone entity with an independence balance sheet and a target minimum AAA credit rating. So the next immediate steps for South Africa will be to finalize its list of pre-qualified bidders. And these bidders would then be able to provide feedback on the pieces of the puzzle that are still yet to be finalized, including the draft request for proposal, the structure of the credit guarantee vehicle, and the draft regulations. The government is expected to issue the finalized request for proposal and begin bidding for the projects no later than Q3 of next year. And the draft regulations seem to indicate that these projects would also be awarded under a build, operate, transfer or build, operate, own transfer model like Brazil. And that cost recovery would also be based on availability of transmission capacity. And just seeing one question in the chat.
Yeah, should we?
Oh, sorry. I got a bit of an echo there.
Yeah, Natalia, I can ask the question directly if you want.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is Osama from Proparco. I saw that. So you said that in Brazil there was a system called RAB to remunerate the investor. My question is, does the RAB only cover the investment cost, the capex, or also the opex, the operation of the network? And if so, how is it predefined for a long duration, 30 years? Because it's I mean, there are evolutions in the market, new technologies, new energy mix that changes the cost structure. So how is that captured in the RAP?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the RAP is submitted by the project developer themselves, and like the graph that I showed before shows the difference between the RAP that's accepted and the initial basically revenue cap that ANIL, the regulatory agency, laid out. And so these tariffs ultimately cover both the cost of investment, and also operating costs, as well as taxes and other fees associated with regulatory processes. And there's also a adjustment mechanism for inflation that's built into the RAP as well. That would also kind of take into account some of these changes in the market as, things evolve over the years. So I think I would say there's some kind of minimum criteria for what is included and the calculations that go into the revenue cap that Anil puts out. And then the project developer would be comparing that with their own calculations for the duration of the project. But the short answer is yes, it covers costs beyond just investment.
Okay, thank you. And when you say project developer, you mean the company that you both construct and operate the network, no, part of the network.
Exactly. So the project developer, I mean the concessionaire, which might be a group, a consortium of investors and entities who will come together and create a special purpose vehicle for the sake of the project.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So I think we can just end, and I'll wrap up quickly because I know we're a bit short on time, with a final example before I pass it over to Lorenzo to talk about different financial models. But this is one that we find quite interesting because it may be the very first ITP in Africa, developed in Kenya by a consortium led by Africa 50 and the Power Grid Corporation of India. And there's a few things about this project that are different from the Brazilian and South African examples. The main one is that we've been talking a lot about the competitive bidding processes and auctions, and this project was actually the result of a privately initiated proposal. So to provide some background, the Kenyan Electricity Transmission Company, or KETRACO, was established in 2008 as a 100% government-owned parastatal agency within the Ministry of Energy. Historically, the National Treasury has borrowed loans directly from development partners for transmission infrastructure capital, and subsequently on-granted those funds to KETRACO for project development. Most of those loans came from the World Bank, African Development Bank, and other MTPs like the JICA, AFT, the European Investment Bank, and others. And typically, the project turnaround time for these projects between the development financing partners and KETRACO were around 5 to 8 years. And these delays were causing bottlenecks in grid development, to keep up with generation capacity. So Kachaka began looking into other financing models to bridge this gap. And Kenya received extensive technical assistance from several multilateral institutions to build out their capacity on public-private partnerships. Under an African Development Bank program, several government agencies, including Kachako, but also the National Treasury, the Ministry of Energy, and the Electricity Regulator, were engaged in the development of a policy for privately initiated investment proposals that details the legal, financial, environmental, and technical criteria that need to be taken into account to receive and approve one of these proposals. And in parallel, the agencies received trainings on making ITPs bankable, including risk identification, affordability concerns, financial analyses, and other aspects. So the key outcomes of these trainings were to prepare Kenya to receive project proposals and also to pilot and support support and finance structures for ITPs in Africa with the aim of scaling these mechanisms up for other countries in the region. So the government passed a number of pieces of legislation, including the PPP Act in 2021, which defines some regulatory terms for auctions. They put together this PIP policy for receiving privately initiated proposals. And they also defined priority projects under the Transmission Master Plan, as well as government support available under a government support measures policy. In 2022, they received a proposal from the joint venture of Africa 50 and the Power Grid Corporation of India for the development of two key projects under the Transmission Master Plan. The project's contract is still under negotiation, but we know that Africa 50 and Power Grid have gone in on a 60-40 equity ratio, and they're targeting a debt equity ratio of 75-25, with project documentation identifying the African Development Bank, FMO, and TDB as potential senior lenders. So it remains to be seen how this project pans out, but I think that it's an interesting case study and also highlights the roles of development institutions in paving the way for these kind of projects to come to life in different regions. With that, I will hand it over to my colleague Lorenzo, who is going to discuss some more examples of alternative financing models.
Thank you, Natalie. And as previously mentioned, in the next two examples, we will try to tackle financing mechanisms that are not strictly related to grids itself, but that are strictly related to maybe energy access in Africa. For example, in this first case, we will focus on Nigeria and how they were able to trigger the sector, especially of mini grids. In the past, in order to tackle the energy access deficit, the Nigeria Electrification Project was created and reinforced by the DARES program, so the distributed access through renewable energy scale-up project that was a funded project by the World Bank. Historically, the main subsidies were the minimum subsidy tender and the performance or output based grants. However, those subsidies would have always arrived a bit later after the verification of specific milestone or objectives, creating a kind of a bottleneck and burden for the developers that are low in capital capabilities, so creating serious cash flow and liquidity risks. On the other hand, we have projects that are kind or often too small for many finance providers. That is why in 2021, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, the Impact Investor All-On Odyssey, launched the DART program, the Demand Aggregation for Renewable Technology, with the objective to lower costs and to create projects large enough for private investors or DFIs. Again, the objective was to provide a specific and dedicated aggregated procurement financing logistic platform that was able to streamline different operators and different developers in the Nigeria context. Going a bit into detail, on the one side, we have the Impact Investor All-On that is the fund management of the facility. This facility is able to provide short-term loans to developers so that they don't need to pay in advance the total capex. And these loans are up to 24 months with a 6 months moratorium. These loans are just available to those developers that have been eligible from the Odyssey platform. That is the second player that we have in this program. Indeed, on the other side, we have Odyssey that is responsible to the demand aggregation that is super important in all this part, because was able to aggregate in different orders from different developers and negotiating the minimum quantities directly with the suppliers, with quantity, price, and volume, so that they were able to reduce strongly the cost of the different components. In total, all ON and the Alliance have provided 25 million respectively to operationalize the DART program, and by pooling demand and getting bulk discounts, they were able to reduce the capex barriers for the different developers, and also to tackle the foreign exchange and cash flow risks for developers. If we take a look a bit of the objectives that have been reached, we have more or less doubled in the last 3 years the committed capital. There was a proven 40% cost savings through aggregation and standardization of components, especially on the PV technology. There was also a strong reduction of upfront burden for developers that, as I mentioned before, are characterized by low capital capability. And finally, more financing has been unlocked by the lenders. So if on one side in Nigeria, this has been proven as a very good example on innovative finance, we wanted also to show another possibility that applies more on solar home system technologies. So the securitization that allows companies to obtain off balance sheet financing. Normally, pay-as-you-go companies and investors work directly together, but from one side we have low energy demand, and from the other side, not a trustful environment for investors. That is why an innovative structure is the one to create and introduce a third entity called the Special Purpose Vehicle, or SPV, that becomes the actual legal owner of the receivables. So, owning the receivable, the SPV can issue security backed by those future payments. And because these receivables are moved off the company's balance sheet, investor risk is reduced and financing terms improve. To protect investors from currency depreciation, the SPV usually applies hedging instrument like TCX, for example, typically through a forward contract or a cross-currency swap. Through this management of the risk, investors are more comfortable to lend money to the SPV that is able then to bring cash, so working capital, to companies that normally has low capital capabilities. On the other side, in the context of the solar home system, we have the environment that goes on, and there is the local currency payments that goes from the household to the solar pay-as-you-go company that is able, through the receivables, to give the SPV this local currency. So the strong addition to this project is that we are seeing a double currency exchanges between the three partners, the three players of the mechanism. To conclude, different outcomes have been reached. For example, developers shift from some debt off their balance sheet, lowering leverage and improving their financial health. The capital raised by SPV flows directly back to the solar home system company that in this way has capability to have cash and so invest more locally. And finally, it allows developers to access hard currency working capital through the SPV that handles currency risk through hedging mechanisms. These are two examples that are a bit far away from the transmission lines, but we thought they were really interesting, and they were also published in one of the reports that James mentioned at the beginning. Now I'll pass the floor again to James and open for different questions.
Great. So we ran over by about 17 minutes, so hopefully that leaves a bit of time for Q&A. But open to any any questions or comments or reflections or experiences that others would want to share. Has anybody in the room worked on grids financing? I mean, it would be interesting from our perspective to hear directly from this audience, whether they're thinking about financing grids, what are some of the challenges that you're identifying, any lessons learned during that experience, or even just to understand where you are in thinking about grids investment and in the context of the energy transition.
James, could you please stop sharing your screen so it's easier to see you? And everyone, please feel free to just open your cameras and your mic. This is the last session of the year, so we still have about 10 minutes. So please enjoy this time.
And also to add to James, as was mentioned, we will start working on the financing transmission lines in Africa. So we will be more than happy to have a discussion with a financier or developers or anyone that has experience in this field.
Thank you, Laurent.
Hello. One question on somehow the interaction between TND and renewable. Would you mind telling us a bit more about net metering? I'm asking the question because in many countries where it has been about allowing producers but also consumers to generate their own power and then to send to the grid the excess energy. The big question came on first the cost of the infrastructure associated to this type of production, because nobody wanted to bear such a cost. On second, the price, because obviously the consumer producer would like to offset at the same price. However, the distribution company has to cover for all their other costs, operating costs, on losses, and so on. So what is your perception of this kind of tension between net metering and TND, in particular distribution?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I can start and then if you have any examples from African context. So this is something I have been thinking about a lot, and we wrote about a little bit in our report, World Energy Investment 2025, where we tried to zoom in a bit on the case of Pakistan. So on the one hand, net metering in countries such as Pakistan has been an incredibly successful policy in deploying distributed solar. We have seen quite an incredible solar boom. This is very sort of decentralized, community-led model to decarbonizing the power system, and that's super exciting. At the same time, as you're probably aware, it can have some potentially bad consequences for the transmission and distribution operators. And so we've seen really the ratepayer base in Pakistan kind of fall off a cliff. And some people are calling it a bit of a doom loop for the national grid of Pakistan. So this is a tricky one, and I wish I had a good answer for your question in terms of that tension and how you get it right. I think, of course, like you need to be quite careful in terms of deciding what the right price level is and thinking about the distributional implications of incentivizing distributed solar, because if it's only the most affluent households that can afford these home solar systems, then they're just pushing off the cost of investments into traditional T&D onto lower income households. So that's something you don't want to see. But then I think there's been other cases like in Africa where they've had net metering systems, but as you said, or I think as you alluded to, Laurent, just the cost of actually getting those net metering systems set up has really prevented that from some of these policies really having a lot of success. So getting that balance is super important. I think this is going to be a really important question moving forward. I wish I had the answer. What is the right balance? Unfortunately, I don't, but maybe Lorenzo can add to that.
I don't have the right answer, but I would just like to add the importance of mini grids in this context. For example, we have seen an increasing attention to interconnected mini grids in Africa that are actually locally supporting the reliability or the reduction of costs in the distribution part. What we have highlighted, and we are still focusing a bit for the next report that we publish next year, is how a regulatory framework can be a barrier or a way to unleash this sector. We have seen different countries that are trying to reduce also the minimum power requirements to be able then to participate to this net metering modeling. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm conscious because we've spoken so much about Brazil's ITP system, and we have 2 individuals or more from BNDES on the call. I don't want to put either of you on the spot, Natalia or Vinicius, but I think we as a team would be really interested to understand, your perspective on the ITP system and how you think it's gone. Is this viewed as a success in Brazil? Has it had any unintentional consequences? We've heard some potentially some geopolitical concerns come up in terms of which countries are providing the equipment, etc. And so, I mean, if you wouldn't mind saying something, that would be great. But no worries if not.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon to all. My name is Guilherme and I work for the BNDES in the energy division team. I think that I can contribute a little bit on the discussions. Despite my team doesn't, we don't analyze projects, and we are more a regulatory team and institutional relation with the sector. So we are kind of the specialists, the energy specialists of BNDES here. But I would like to add, I really liked the presentation, Natalie presentation. I just wanted to add that one other aspect that is important in our model, in our framework, that is the revenue, the REP is received by the transmission operator, but the payments of the REP is widespread on the system. So every user of the system, every consumer, every generator, they have to pay a small amount to all the transmission operators. So the credit risk is very low for the payment of the REP. So for the revenue of the transmission operator, and all this model and these risk mitigating measures that were built made the investment in transmission in the country be regarded as very low risk. So it's very attractive to the market. So despite BNDES had this very important role of being a great financier and have the long-term funds in local currency, all the aspects that made that created this good environment for the investment. The good aspect is that We also, while providing the funding for these projects and while making the system feasible, we also helped to develop the local capital markets. And today, the local capital markets provides much more funding, especially for transmission, than BNDES. So we are more complementary to the market because the market sees these assets as very low risk assets and fixed revenue assets because of these environments. So I think that's the 2 points that I would like to add. The role that we also played, not only financing, but also helping to taking more risk to allow emissions, the batteries emissions on the projects, sharing risks with the bondholders. So all this, we not only helped to finance, but also to bring the capital markets and develop also the capital markets for that. The 2 aspects. And okay, regarding the distributed generation and this question of what's the balance, what's the balance between we are going through a very good challenge here because of distributed generation. We saw, because of our net metering system, we saw a very unprecedented growth of distributed generation here. In the last 5 years, distributed generation became from 0 to the second largest energy source in our mix, only behind the hydropower. And the result is that we are facing very large numbers of curtailment on the renewables because there is too much energy during the day because distributed solar is and the hydro, the rest of the system, we are lacking flexibility to accommodate all this generation. And so we are facing, for the centralized wind and solar generation, very large shares of curtailed energy. And that's the hot topic today. That's the discussion, because it's been very hard to accommodate. So distributed generation, it has a different mindset of the power sector. We were used to deal with very large companies, but very few companies. And now distributed generation is, it's a retail market. It's thousands of agents, and the discussion is being very hard to remove this 100% net metering. I think that the solution would be the balance would be, okay, distributed generation is super competitive now. It doesn't need any more incentives. So we should go as fast as we could to a net metering that only compensates the energy on the tariff, because we have a tariff with a lot of components. Energy is around 30% of the tariff, of the energy tariffs in Brazil. So net metering should only compensate this 30%, but it compensates the 100% of the tariff. So all the losses, the transmission costs, the distribution costs, all the other costs of the system are not being paid by users with distributed generation, and it's a very big distortion today. But it's very hard to the agency tried to remove the incentives, but the Congress didn't allow us to do so, and that's a contest now being discussed on the Congress, and it's a much tougher discussion to overcome. So I'm sorry, I don't want to monopolize. I just wanted to contribute on these 2 topics.
Oh, that was super valuable intervention. So thank you for sharing your experiences. I think from our perspective, when we talk about grid financing, we always go back to the Brazilian ITP model because, as you said, it just, for us, it seems like a model where we saw things really fall into place quite well. It's just a very nice case study, we think. But I didn't at all make the connection to the net metering in Brazil, and that's exactly right. But yeah, I think like you, a lot of people are starting to think through this challenge, and I think we probably need to start thinking through this more a little bit too. We're seeing this flood of cheap Chinese solar panels making its way into Africa, and so kind of understanding what is the optimal pathway to, you know, sustainably incentivize the deployment of distributed solar. We should be seeing this as a force for good, but to align the business models with traditional T&D companies in such a way that it can grow sustainably is, I don't know the answer to that question. But thank you. I know we're over time. I'm not sure if anybody else has another intervention. Everybody's dropped off already.
Well, if there are no other questions, I can maybe close. I see Margot. Do you want to quickly jump in to ask your question before I close this meeting?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So the question is, in the context of grids that are still highly powered by fossil fuels and SOE-led model, what financing approaches can effectively ring fence or structure renewable enabling transmission and distribution investments so that they are financially and operationally distinct from coal-linked assets? Yeah, I mean, so I think that this sort of, I don't have the slides open, but I mentioned before there's this kind of class of transmission line that I named the dedicated IPP evacuation. But this is sort of like a special purpose IPT model, but you know, it combines the generation source and the transmission line. And so when you have this investment vehicle like an SPV or joint venture, where the renewable generation source and the power evacuation line are built and financed together, my understanding is that, you know, this already is sufficiently ring fenced, such that it is fully recognized under, you know, like the common principles that this is a green enabling investment. Where things become a little bit more troubling is these traditional grid to grid or just domestic grid strengthening projects. And so it is very difficult. I mean, you can ring fence them in a financial structuring sense, but I think trying to isolate them from the rest of the grid that's still dependent heavily on fossil power is much more challenging. And so there's been a lot of discussions about moving away from this sort of binary criteria of meeting a certain emissions intensity requirement towards some more fluid criteria where we ask ourselves, you know, like how much more renewable power is this transmission line enabling over a rolling 10-year period or something like this. So it is difficult to completely ring fence it unless it's a dedicated power evacuation project, but we would like to see sort of the criteria sort of recognize the longer term enabling role of transmission projects in bringing online more variable renewable energy.
I also saw a hand from Ajay. Do you want to jump in?
No, nothing.
Was your question maybe addressed already, Ajay? Do you want to ask your question?
Tawana, are you referring to me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh no, there was no question. Sorry.
There was no question. Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
I saw a hand, but that's fine. So yeah, and we are already 37, so maybe we can close here. We could, of course, continue discussions all day long. But as we close this capacity building journey, I want to thank all participants for your dedication and willingness to grow together throughout this 2025 climate capacity building campaign that was especially focused on mobilizing private resources to finance the clean energy transition through blended finance and PPP. So thank you for your commitment and energy you brought to each training session. So huge thanks to Frankfurt School and IEA who so carefully prepared and delivered these high quality sessions. So we had many discussions together and reflections to try to actually meet our IDFC members' needs and expectations. We hope that we achieve it. And don't worry about this thank you and goodbye words. This is not an ending. We have already started to prepare next year's session. We cannot reveal yet the topic or the IDFC member host, but we hope to reveal it very, very soon so we can already mark your calendars. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Happy holidays and see you next year.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.